Hi everybody. How's it going? How you doing? Hi Sandy. Thanks for sharing. Hi Steve Gonzo. Press Secretary Kaylee McEnany. You sure it's not McEnany? When Trump said he wanted to cut off school funding, he meant he wants to increase it. Hi Lana. Hi Kay. Did you see Dr. Pavlina wants to start her own MMT college in Vermont? No, I did not see that. I did not see that. I think Vermont is a really good location for it. There's going to be a college that convenes in the summertime. Because what you going to do about Bard? Hi, Dolores. How are you? Good to see you. I'll wait just a minute for a few more folks to arrive. Well, I actually don't think I'm going to wait any longer because we have a fair amount to do tonight. I'm going to continue with my discussion of the free trade, and then I'll go on to balanced trade and hope to finish them both tonight. Okay, so I'm going back to my book. Who Needs Balanced Trade? Who Needs Balanced Budgets? I was able to set it up tonight so I can use the actual Kindle copy and share that with you. So that should look a bit better than the draft copy I used just yesterday. So he ended with that quote from Ha-Joon Chang and concluded, so it's not through a Ricardian strategy that economic development happens. And then I say, returning once again to Saranovich's exposition, he ends his effort at clarifying Ricardo by recognizing and bringing forth criticisms of the assumptions in the model. And he says that many people who learn about comparative advantage quickly decide that its ability to explain the real world of trade is limited and perhaps non existent. So Ricardo's results may follow from the assumptions of the model. But since the assumptions are unrealistic, i.e., false, as a description of the reality, then material fallacies abound. So it is difficult for people to accept the conclusions of comparative advantage. And then he launches a defense of it, which I'm going to dialogue with now. So Saranovich says, well, Saranovich begins by acknowledging that one of the most difficult aspects of economics is how to interpret conclusions of models. Because, he says, all economic models are simplifications of the real world, and so they all contain unrealistic assumptions. So to that I say, huh? All theories and models are simplifications of the real world because a complete description of the real world in all its complexity is logically impossible to achieve and is not sought by scientific investigation or any other method. But the need to simplify does not imply that all simplifications of the world make, quote, unrealistic, unquote, assumptions. In fact, there are unrealistic assumptions, and there are also false assumptions that purport to describe or explain aspects of the real world. Ricardo's assumptions were unrealistic, and when deductions from them are interpreted as real world propositions, then they are revealed as unwarranted because they involve fallacies that are material, specifically in which the conclusions don't follow from the assumptions. In other words, the logical fallacy that your conclusions don't follow from your assumptions. The conclusions, however, may be true, but if they are, then that is good fortune. It's luck, because the model doesn't provide support for its real-world interpretations. Ceranovich then continues by saying that, therefore, to dismiss the results of economic analysis on the basis of unrealistic assumptions means that one must dismiss all insights contained within the entire economics discipline. Surely this is neither practical nor realistic. Economic models in general, and the Ricardian model in particular, do contain insights that most likely carry over to the more complex real world. All I have to say to that is, nice try, Ceranovich. For reasons stated earlier, this is simply not true. The assumptions made in economic models don't have to be unrealistic. What was done in the Ricardo model was to construct an ideal type, quote unquote. Not all economic models use ideal types. The ones that do don't describe the real world. But useful ideal type models prove their worth in the sciences by leading us by strict by deductions to conclusions that survive empirical testing or are consistent with facts. So the issue here isn't whether Ricardo's model is a simple model or has unrealistic assumptions. It is instead whether its conclusions actually follow from the model and then aren't contradicted by facts. Ceranovich then goes on to say that the usual way of interpreting Ricardo's model makes it easy to reject it as unrealistic. So he offers this as a better way to state the results is as follows. The Ricardian model shows that if we want to maximize total output in the world, then we should, 1, fully employ all resources worldwide. 2, allocate those resources within countries to each country's comparative advantage on industries. And 3, allow the countries to trade freely thereafter. In this way, we might raise the well-being of all individuals despite differences in relative productivities. In this description, we do not predict that a result will carry over to the complex real world. Instead, we carry the logic of comparative advantage to the real world and ask how things would have to look to achieve a certain result, specifically maximum output and benefits. In the end, we should not say that the model of comparative advantage tells us anything about what will happen when two countries begin to trade. Instead, we should say that the theory tells us some things that can happen. Well, I have to say, I'm afraid I don't see the logic of this argument. One cannot, given the assumptions in the Ricardian model, deduce from it the 3 points Saranovich claims follow from it. The model is about dyads comprised of nations, each producing two products, and each having a comparative advantage over the other. And only resources assumed in the model are those needed to produce the products, including the labor needed in the present state of technology used by that labor. There is nothing in the model that allows one to deduce conclusions about fully employing all resources worldwide, quote unquote. The language needed to do that just doesn't exist in the model. So the first point doesn't follow from it. The second point assumes, quote, all resources worldwide, unquote. So it too doesn't follow from the model. And these 2 points I'm making here only refer to logic itself. If the conclusions of a model are not implicit in its assumptions, so that all resources worldwide are implicit in the assumptions, then a conclusion involving the terms all resources worldwide cannot be deduced from the model. It's as simple as that. It's a linguistic point. It's a syntactical point. Okay, if the content isn't there in the premises, you cannot use the rules of syntax and the rules of logic, okay, to deduce a phrase or deduce a sentence that is not implicit in the assumptions. I go on. However, even if, quote, all resources worldwide were allocated to comparative advantage industries, they could not be so allocated at the introduction of, quote, free trade, unquote. Instead, it is a prediction from the model that the process of free trade in a trading dyad will result in all relevant resources being fully employed by the comparative advantage industries involved. So even if the model were modified to include, quote, all resources worldwide, unquote, then the model would still not guarantee that free trade in the worldwide dyads would end with all resources allocated to comparative advantage industries and nations. That is, such a prediction would still have to be tested, and there are no real world conditions allowing us to test that right now. So Saranovich seems to be assuming that in the situation he envisions, the market would be effective in allocating all resources worldwide to comparative advantage industries. But how can this happen unless all resources worldwide, quote unquote, can be made available to the market, quote unquote? Realistically, we know that cannot happen because we know that there are many social institutions in each nation, including the government itself, that are not subject to the market and that require and command resources. In addition, there is no central authority in the world that can see to it that even as much of all worldwide resources as can be spared would be allocated to the comparative advantage industries. And even if there were, such a government cannot allow all worldwide resources, quote unquote, to be absorbed by industry simply because there is more to life than industry and private business involved in international trade. Lastly, given the above difficulties with extending the model in the way Saranovich imagines, there is no question of getting to the point of allowing the countries to trade freely thereafter, because it is highly implausible that third point will even become an issue, since it too depends on the first point, which again doesn't follow from the model. Next, The idea that we carry the logic of comparative advantage to the real world and ask how things would have to look to achieve the maximum output gain benefits is highly questionable. First, what logic beyond the rules of logic can be carried over if all or most of the assumptions in the model are false in the real world? And second, if the rules of logic are carried over, then the result will be that all the consequences of the model will be false, and any conclusions drawn by using material fallacies will be unwarranted by the model. Third, we already know how things would have to look to achieve maximum output benefits, and that would be to replace the international trading system with a world government and a world trading system in which free markets were tightly regulated to remove their tendencies to degenerate into oligarchy, and in which they would be strictly confined to those areas, unlike health insurance, the banking, and government itself, and any industry that has devolved into non-competitiveness where markets can work to achieve good results. Whether one agrees with the particular statement and its policy orientation or not, it certainly seems clear that if we have maximum output and benefits as our goals, then we need to have a world government and an economic system in which diversification, division of labor, and specialization can occur to achieve Saranovic's two goals, without regard to barriers imposed by nationhood, differences in law, currency differences, or other impediments produced by the nation-state structure of the work, so that Adam Smith's processes of division of labor can proceed unimpeded by the nation-state structure. But this, of course, has nothing to do with Ricardo's model, which assumes continuation of the nation-state structure of the dyads. So here we go with the conclusion of the chapter on free trade. So as Galbraith and the various other considerations above make painfully clear, there is no basis in Ricardo's model for concluding that comparative advantage can lead one to the conclusion that, quote, free trade, unquote, as a generalized policy or even policy orientation bias is justified. No, Ricardo's model is a toy model, sufficient to provide a tool for ideology and a rationalization for people who want to pursue free trade, quote unquote, for other reasons. But there is nothing in it to suggest that the model can be extended to relationships in the real world of hundreds of nations and many thousands, or is it millions of products, real and potential, that do or will exist in the real world? Neoliberal economists genuflect towards Ricardo and his model because of their ideological commitment to free markets and the intellectual investments they have made in market studies and market models. Their ideological commitment makes them unwilling to say that his models produce conclusions that are flat out false in the real world because they're widely contradicted by experience and data. Instead, they have recourse to the sort of lame defenses of comparative advantage we have seen in Krugman and Saranovich. They don't want to offend the economic establishment and the mainstream politicians by saying, with Jamie Galbraith, quote, I can say it flatly, Ricardo was wrong. Comparative advantage has very little practical use for trade strategy. Or he might have said trade policy either. So they dissemble by talking about the models, quote unquote, providing insights, quote unquote, and increased understanding, quote unquote, without the slightest evidence or demonstrations that these results have informed successful economic theories that survive our tests or experience or have contributed to successful trade policies in the real world. Look at the various criticisms of comparative advantage reviewed above. Most object to the model by pointing to the divergence of both the model's assumptions from reality and the divergence of the consequences of, quote, free trade, unquote, policies from the expectations of the model. In other words, they focus on empirical failures severe enough to suggest that economists ought to refute his models and turn their attention to alternatives. Instead, they keep beating the dead horse of comparative advantage, quote unquote, even though it makes them look more like the victims of ideological belief rather than the open pursuers of continuously growing economic knowledge that they purport to be. Finally, this failure of neoliberal economics would be merely ridiculous were it not for the fact that it supports the unthinking, committed, and ideological proponents of uncritical free trade policy in the political sphere. The current trade agreements, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP, and the Trade and Services Agreement, the TISA, now under consideration, they were under consideration in 2015, have as one of their main justifications that they are, quote, free trade, unquote, agreements, and that such agreements are always good for America. This justification finds its support in the theory of comparative advantage, but not often explicitly in the statements of free trade supporters. It was exemplified by Don Beyer, Democrat of Virginia, the 8th CD in Virginia, and my former rep, in his statement of support for the TPA, the Trade Promotion Authority legislation, where he said, quote, I am by education and political philosophy a free trade Democrat, and I have seen up close the enormous impact trade has on our way of life. All the advocates for the trade deals in Congress emphasize they're about free trade, which they view as an unquestioned good. Their arguments for it aren't very subtle or detailed. They just assume that the economic benefits for all parties attributed to, quote, free trade, unquote, in the neoclassical version of the theory of comparative advantage will come about if we just allow the president to negotiate these agreements. The president, of course, was Obama at that time, and also to have an expedited congressional approval process afterwards. I don't think they'd be so happy about that now because Trump is the president. Don Beyer on his website talks about his own experience with international trade, and he talks about its impact. It was certainly positive for Don Beyer and his employees because he was a very successful Volvo dealer before he went into politics. And by all accounts, from people I've known in the Northern Virginia area, an honest and excellent one, providing very good service. Though what was the net impact of his trading activities on the United States and the world? He has no way of assessing that because, contrary to his claim, he has only seen part of the picture, quote, up close, unquote. All he really knows is that free trade, quote unquote, or trade in Volvos anyway, was good for him, his family, his employees, his customers, and his community in Falls Church, Virginia, and in surrounding cities and counties. So his claim that his experience in trade is relevant to whether the upcoming trading agreements are likely to be beneficial to the United States and to our trading partners as well isn't really credible, and we need to discount it. In fact, the question we need to ask is whether each of these proposed trade agreements is consistent with free trade Ricardian dogma, but whether it is likely to have a positive impact on the United States and also on our trading partners. I think that there was a word left out of this previous sentence, so let me state it correctly. In fact, the question we need to ask is not whether each of these proposed trade agreements is consistent with free trade dogma, but instead whether it is likely to have a net positive impact on the United States and also on our trading partners. After all, in international trade, we don't want to be engaged in a race to the bottom. We want the deals we conclude to be good for us, but also for, quote, our partners, unquote. And arguably, deals we have concluded in the past have fallen far short of this particular standard. Don Beyer's views about free trade and its benefits apply to a fantasy world, but not to the world we live in, just as the views of all the other free trade Democrats, Republicans, and the president also exist in that world. As with so much else, these office holders ignore fact, experience, data, and history, just as their neoliberal economic advisors do. It is the case of the blind leading the blind, all in the service of the multinationals buying their worldviews, ideas about economic policy, and their loyalty. It is time to leave this review of free trade justifications and policies behind and to consider alternative trade policies. And that brings us to the next chapter on balanced trade policy. Since the onset of the Great Depression, the advocates of free trade policy have overwhelmingly had the upper hand in the developed economies over advocates of other trade policies. But the increasing success of developing economies, as well as the case of post-World War II Japan, has weakened the free trade edifice by providing successful protectionist counterexamples to expectations rationalized by the theory of comparative advantage. More recently, the apparent negative impacts of NAFTA and other, including bilateral free trade agreements that have formed part of the globalization movement, have been creating a narrative of free trade and its discontents. The discontent is fueling globalization protests against neoliberal trade and financial agendas across the world. As the process of the globalization, accompanied as it has been by growing inequality in developed nations, and most recently by fiscal austerity, has gone forward, new trade policy orientations are beginning to appear and gain support. In this chapter, I'll consider the doctrine of balanced trade policy, quote unquote, and in the next, I'll review fair trade policy, quote unquote. Both formulations are fairly recent developments. What is balanced trade policy? That's the next section. The basic idea behind balanced trade policy is that since free trade hasn't been self-regulating with respect to balancing trade deficits and surplus, either annually or over any reasonable period of time, government ought to do what the international market cannot ensure. Specifically, that trade is balanced. The first rumblings about balanced trade policy came from the business community in 2002 when William R. Hawkins, then a senior fellow for national security studies at the U.S. Business and Industry Council, called for an end to free trade policy and direct limiting of imports. And he said, quote, Few things better demonstrate the foolishness of our present trade policy and those like the National Association of Manufacturers who support it, NAM he called them, than the argument that it is better to gut the value of the dollar than to deviate from the sterile dogma of free trade that allows large deficits to accumulate. Of course, he was here referring to trade deficits. Instead, the Bush administration should be taking direct measures to reduce the trade deficit, which means limiting imports, both to defend the dollar's integrity and America's economic strength. A trade policy that actually protected American-based, that actually protected American, I'm sorry, American-based products would greatly reduce the risk of investment in the United States, which in turn would both support and be supported by a strong dollar. But it was, end quote, but it was Warren Buffett who a little more than a year later offered a proposal to ensure the end of trade deficits. He considered these dangerous to the United States and unsustainable because he viewed the growing accumulation of U.S. net financial assets in foreign hands as eventually leading to foreign holders of net financial assets using them to acquire real property in quantities sufficient to shift a dangerous proportion of American real assets into foreign hands. In addition, he viewed the growing trade deficits as resulting in currency adjustments, producing a devaluation of the dollar in international markets. His narrative supporting such a conclusion, a story about two islands, Thriftville and Squanderville, is comprised of many leaps of logic, myths about the way money works in the American system, also about how Americans behave, and inferences about impossible intergenerational inequities, quote unquote, resulting from the consequences of debt instrument accumulations and other problems I won't review here. But his analysis of the situation, mistaken or not, provides the context for his proposal to follow a balanced trade policy in which government policy ensures that trade deficits cannot occur. Here's his proposal. Quote, my remedy may sound gimmicky, and in truth it is a tariff called by another name. But this is a tariff that retains most free market virtues, neither protecting specific industries, nor punishing specific countries, nor encouraging trade wars. This plan would increase our exports and might well lead to increased overall world trade. And it would balance our books without there being a significant decline in the value of the dollar, which I believe is otherwise almost certain to occur. We would achieve this balance by issuing what I will call import certificates, ICs, to all U.S. exporters in an amount equal to the dollar value of their exports. Each exporter would in turn sell the ICs to parties, either exporters abroad or importers here, wanting to get goods into the United States. To import 1 million of goods, for example, an importer would need import certificates that were the byproduct of $1 million of exports. The inevitable result, trade balance. Buffett's idea was later taken up by then Senators Byron Dorgan, who was a Democrat from South Dakota, by the way, a very progressive Democrat, generally speaking, and a somewhat lesser progressive Democrat, but still a very progressive one in certain respects. Russ Feingold, who was a Democrat from Wisconsin, who authored a short, simple bill called the Balanced Trade Restoration Act of 2006. The bill has languished in the Senate since, but advocacy for the principle of balanced trade has been taken up by the Richmonds in 3 publications, 2003, 2008, and 2014, who proposed variations on Buffett's proposal, and Kenneth N. Davis of Balanced Trade Associates, who proposed an updated version of the idea in 2014. Balanced Trade Associates has also proposed the Balanced Trade Restoration Act of 2016. So you can see the balanced trade idea is still being supported and is still relatively current at this point. In addition, the Progressive Campaign for the American Future, the CAF, the labor union supported CAF, has also taken up the idea in posts by Dave Johnson, I linked to that post, and by Borisage, who I mentioned earlier in earlier chapters. The Coalition for a Prosperous America, another prominent advocate of balanced trade, offers a statement of principles with an attractive graphical summary of issues. Importantly, Dave Johnson cites a working paper by the Economic Policy Institute, which is another well-known progressive think tank. I put the term in quotes when I say progressive, showing that import restrictions for balance of payment purposes, such as those envisioned by Buffett, and especially later balance of trade policy proposals, would not violate the general agreement on trade and tariffs, and would not also violate the World Trade Organization rules. Also, Papadimitriou and Hansgen in 2008 of the Levy Institute completed a balanced evaluation of the Buffett plan and offered an alternative consistent with international trade agreements. It was notable, that is the Papadimitriou and Hansgen plan, was notable for taking into account the sectoral financial balances orientation to the economy, without actually recognizing the implications of monetary sovereignty, but also using simulation to project the results of both the Buffett idea, his proposal, and their own alternative. In addition to the Buffett plan and its variations, a more comprehensive view of how balanced trade might be implemented was provided by Michael McKeever and the McKeever Institute. This plan envisions a nation conforming to a range of additional policy requirements to supplement balanced trade. Those requirements include a wide range of policies setting a societal context for the successful operation of balanced trade. Now, that is very interesting because, of course, Warren Buffett never did that. Whether McKeever is right or wrong about the details of these requirements, his approach to balanced trade involves an ideological policy agenda that isn't specified by the other advocates for that position. On the other hand, his statement of balanced trade policy itself is relatively abstract compared to the proposals of others. Quote, balanced trade is a simple concept which says that a country should import only as much as it exports so that trade and money flows are balanced. A country can balance its trade either on a trading partner basis, in which total money flows between two countries are equalized, or it can balance the overall trade and money flow so that a trade deficit with one country is balanced by a trade surplus with another country. Of course, Variations in the proposals reflecting the original budget, the Buffett plans are important, but the basic question is whether any plan that proposes to limit trade deficits on the basis of a general rule is in the interest of the United States or other nations. I'll address that question later in this chapter, but now let's move on to expectations about how a balanced trade policy would work if implemented in the manner suggested by Buffett or in alternative policy proposals by the Richmonds, Davis, the Levy Institute, and the EPI. The CAF position of Johnson and Borsage reflects the policy alternative put forward by the Levy Institute scholars. Okay. So, in other words, their view is the same as the Levy Institute scholars' view. If balanced trade policy worked, is the next section. Here is a summary presented as a list of points characterizing what Buffett thought would happen in 2003 when he offered his proposal. I have embellished a bit, but only to strengthen one claim or another, not to discredit any of them. So, the first bullet point, import certificates would be issued in huge equivalent quantities to exports and would surely trade in an exceptionally liquid market. Competition would then determine who among our trading partners wanting to sell to us would buy the ICs and at what price. To prevent speculators banking and accumulating ICs rather than spending them, the ICs would be given a short-term time limit to use, perhaps 6 months. If each IC sold for 10 cents per dollar of exports behind them, then other things being equal, the amount would mean a U.S. producer could realize 10% more by selling his goods in the export market than by selling them domestically, with the extra 10% coming from his sale of import certificates. This reduction in cost would let exporters cut prices of their products in international markets. Commodity-type products would particularly encourage this kind of behavior. So the output of the U.S. would become significantly more competitive. Exports would expand, and the number of jobs here in the U.S. would grow. Foreigners selling to the U.S. would face tougher economics, but a solution to the long-term trade imbalance producing continuous deficits for the U.S., quote, must come, unquote. In one way, the import certificate approach would give countries selling to us great flexibility, since the plan does not penalize any specific industry or product. In the end, the free market would determine what would be sold in the U.S. and who would sell it. Sure, if we had a free market, but I digress. The import certificates would determine only the aggregated dollar volume of what was sold. To see the impact on imports, think about a car import at 20,000. If IC sell for 10%, the importer's cost rises to 22,000. Competitive forces would very often, but not always, require the foreign manufacturer to absorb some or all of the $2,000 import certificate cost. Next, there is no free lunch in the import certificate plan, which has serious negative consequences for consumers. Prices of most imports and certain competitive products that are manufactured domestically would increase. And so the import certificates would act as a sales tax on those consumers who were willing to pay more for imports than before. The import certificate plan, quote, would produce rather promptly a U.S. trade equilibrium well above present export levels, but below present import levels. The certificates would moderately aid all our industries in world competition, even as the free market determined which of them ultimately met the test of, quote, comparative advantage, unquote. The plan would generally not be copied by nations that are net exporters because their import certificates would be valueless. Going on, there would be no retaliation from trading partners who have been running a trade surplus with us because the plan does not attempt, to create an unreasonable surplus, but only balance the trade. I don't want to digress again before the time for criticism comes. And also because retaliation would only result in another reduction of imports from the retaliating country, since they would then need even more of our import certificates to continue exporting to us. In other words, because of the way the import certificate scheme works, trade retaliation designed to curtail our exports to them would be self-defeating. Next, the likely outcome of an import certificate plan is that the exporting nations, after some initial posturing, will turn their ingenuity to encouraging imports from us. If ICs existed, then China would have the following choices. One, it could buy ICs to fill the gap that existed previously. Two, it could reduce the need for ICs by cutting exports to the United States. Three, it could increase imports or asset purchases from us. Four, it could do some combination of these. The most palatable for China would probably be three, increase imports or asset purchases from us. If our exports increased and the supply of import certificates was large, their price would be driven down. With sufficient expansion, quote, import certificates would be rendered valueless and the entire plan would be moot. Presented with the power to make this happen, important exporting countries might quickly eliminate the mechanisms they now use to inhibit exports from us, unquote. Quote again, and the next point, were we to install an import certificate plan, we might opt for some transition years in which we deliberately ran a relatively small deficit, a step that would enable the world to adjust as we gradually got where we need to be, unquote. The alternative balanced trade proposals from the Richmonds, Balanced Trade Associates, and the Levy researchers would have somewhat different impacts produced by different procedures for assigning and targeting the ICs. The Buffett proposal provided for issuing ICs to U.S. exporters who could then sell them in open markets. Both the buyers and the sellers of the ICs would benefit from this scheme. The Richmond proposal differs from Buffett's in that it auctions off the ICs to buyers, who presumably would be importers. The government would pocket the returns from the auctions. The ICs would be specific to individual countries running surpluses with the U.S. as measured by their holding excessive amounts of our reserves. So unlike Buffett's plan, the Richmond plan would not directly affect most trading partners, but only those who have been running continuous and relatively large surpluses with the United States compared to the amount of the total trade deficit. So we're talking about the 4 or 5 largest surplus nations with the U.S., like countries like the oil exporters to the U.S., and of course China and Japan, and so on. And the Richmonds see this as a big advantage compared to GATT and WTO rules, since there is very specific targeting on nations actually contributing to the U.S.'s trade imbalances rather than toward every nation trading with the U.S. Also, unlike the Buffett plan, theirs would not actually produce completely balanced trade, but only balanced trade with the mercantilist nations, quote unquote. It would trust to the quote free market unquote to maintain the relatively balanced situation with the rest of the world. The Levy Institute, a variation on an IC-based plan, would work more like the uh, uh, um, like the Buffett proposal, but it would auction the import certificates to importers and would not target them in any particular nations. And exporters would not be charged for import certificates. The government would then use the proceeds from auctions to offset reductions in payroll taxes. Okay, so in other words, the proceeds would go to Social Security trust funds. Okay, in other words, the proceeds would actually be destroyed, but there would be credits given to the Social Security trust funds, which of course only need credits because we pretend they are something that they are not. In this way, some of the pain people would experience in higher import prices would be alleviated by the tax cuts, as would the negative effects of the increased prices on the economy until trade was largely balanced and the volume of import certificates auction would no longer fund such tax cuts. Based on its simulations, a Levy study shows that their balanced trade alternative to Buffett's proposal would more fairly reward workers for their efforts, exporters, okay, and producers of non-traded goods would find their costs would be lowered, and fraud would be reduced by the government auctions compared to an open market sales system. The EPI study focused on the relative merits of the Buffett proposal and proposals involving government auctioning of the import certificates. It concluded that the auction method would be more consistent with WTO rules as opposed to Buffett's proposal, and would also produce some revenue for the government that it could use in various ways. Finally, later proposals by the Richmonds included a scaled tariff proposal. In a scaled tariff, quote, the rate of the duty is adjusted quarterly and calculated as the rate that would cause the revenue taken in by the duty upon imported goods from a trade surplus country to equal 50% of the trade deficit with that country over the most recent 4 economic quarters. The Richmonds expect that a scaled tariff scheme to achieve balanced trade would be highly consistent with Article 12 of the WTO treaty because it targets import certificates only at trade surplus nations and also provides for duties that would be adjusted as the surplus falls and then automatically disappear when trade becomes balanced, ensuring that tariffs would not be used to create a new trade imbalance. Sounds very aesthetic, right? Very lovely. This is in close conformity with WTO requirements that the trade barriers imposed for the purpose of removing dangerous imbalances be temporary, be used only for that purpose, and ought to disappear when the trade imbalance does. Now, here are some of the problems with balanced trade policy including the policies that I just got finished discussing and specifying. The various writers advocating balanced trade identify negative consequences. These include: 1, possible trade retaliation; 2, imposing penalties on nations not running continuous and large surpluses with the United States; 3, imposing higher prices on consumers, possibly leading to greater inflation, protecting inefficient U.S. industries; and 4, benefiting exporters at the expense of consumers. I had made a mistake here and said that 4 was number 5, but the only way that could happen is if right after the semicolon there should be 4, and specifically protecting inefficient U.S. industries. That's probably what I intended. So there are 5 points here, actually. And the 4th point is protecting the inefficient industries here in the U.S. Their answers to these problems are to provide reasons why the cost of these effects would not be high or could be ameliorated, and their ultimate defense is to say that none of these problems, nor all of them combined, would be as serious as the consequences of continuing to run a trade deficit. However, there are certain problems they don't confront, which have to do with both their approach to the problem, assuming that there is indeed one, and also with the theory underlying their view that the trade deficit is a problem because it is unsustainable for the United States. I'll begin with the idea that the best trade policy is to have the government legislate policy that will force balanced trade. The idea of legislating balanced trade assumes that all that is wrong with the Ricardian trade model is that attempting to follow it by actually negotiating so-called free trade treaties is not enough, because they haven't actually produced the balanced trade result one would expect from the Ricardian model. Then they tacitly make the further assumption that if the government only forced balanced trade, then comparative advantage would work, and the expectations of the Ricardian theorists deduced from the Ricardian model would be realized in the real world. But what is the basis of that assumption? Why ought one to believe it? Why do the proponents of balanced trade actually believe it? The facts suggesting that the Ricardian model doesn't work are reality. One can either conclude that the Ricardian assumptions have not been fulfilled, or that the Ricardian theory is false when applied to the real world. And as Jamie Galbraith suggests, quote, there is no such thing as free trade, unquote, in the international system. But for myself, I prefer the second verdict. But even for people who believe the first alternative, the Ricardian model leads us to expect that, quote, balanced trade, unquote, is a consequence of allowing free trade, not a requirement for free trade to work as it should in producing the various desirable consequences of free trade, including balanced trade, in the first place. So this change in their assumptions is itself a repudiation of the Ricardian model and is an attempt to offer a revisionist model. Yet this last is what the proponents of balanced trade policy believe. So the question for them is, what theoretical justification do they have for the notion that a model that assumes the requirement of balanced trade because it is forced by government policy and also retains the other Ricardian assumptions is internally consistent and will accurately predict the other implications of a comparative advantage specified by the classical Ricardian model or its neoclassical revisions? In one respect, any modified trade model that is Ricardian, that assumes a regulated balanced trade to start with, seems to violate the free market assumption required for comparative advantage to do its job in the first place. That is, since a policy of balanced trade assumes that regulation by the government will enforce balance, there clearly is no, quote, free market, unquote, operating when one or both trading partners use balanced trade policy. Instead, the government would be keeping certain U.S. exporters in business that have no comparative advantage in the products they're trying to export. But keeping them in business through a balanced trade policy would certainly contradict the assumptions of the Ricardian theory. And according to that theory, such a policy would not produce the optimal economic growth in the system comprised of both trading patterns by that comprised of both trading partners that is actually predicted by the Ricardian model. Indeed, the proponents of balanced trade policy don't know from theory what sorry don't know from theory what the outcome for economic growth would be of actually protecting exporters from the market in this way. Warren Buffett claimed that in the end, the free market would determine what would be sold in the United States and who would sell it. The import certificates would determine only the aggregate dollar model of what was sold. But Buffett also claimed that the import certificate plan would produce rather promptly a U.S. trade equilibrium well above present export levels, but below the import levels at present. The certificates would moderately aid all our industries in world competition, even as the free market determined which of them ultimately met the test of comparative advantage, unquote. But again, it would not be the free market determining which of them ultimately met the test of comparative advantage, unquote, simply because the test of comparative advantage assumes that the government will stay out of the process of comparative advantage, working its will through the free market. And of course, if one takes the position that the government must force balanced trade in order to get the free market to work, then what is the reason for the government not to regulate other aspects of international trade to attempt to create favorable outcomes in international trade? Moving now to the issue of the most fundamental problem of all for advocates of balanced trade policy. What actually motivates their policy is the belief that having continuous large trade deficits with other nations is an unsustainable result of current free trade policies being followed by the United States. This is the common thread behind all the proposals advocating balanced trade, whether these come from the financial world or from some of the progressives like the CAF or Levy or the EPI scholars. But is this really a problem? Are continuous large trade deficits really unsuitable for a monetary sovereign nation such as the United States? I'll consider this first by evaluating Warren Buffett's argument that there is indeed an unsustainability problem in continuing to run trade deficits, and afterwards I'll conclude this chapter by arguing that there is no problem in continuous trade deficits as long as the government is willing to enact the necessary policies to allow the domestic economic system to compensate for them. So here is Warren Buffett's argument on sustainability. To evaluate Buffett's argument that there is a problem, I'll dialogue with the main points in his narrative about Thriftville and Scornderville. The main point in the preface to his narrative is this. Our trade deficit is greatly worsened up to the point that our country's net worth, so to speak, is now being transferred abroad at an alarming rate. A perpetuation of this transfer would lead to major trouble. So here's my answer to that quote. There's an immediate problem with these claims. The trade deficit with other nations transfers net financial assets of the private sector to them, mostly in the form of reserves, which the largest surplus trading partners generally, but not necessarily, convert to Treasury securities. This transfer makes a difference in their portfolio distribution, lowering the proportion of U.S. reserves they hold and increasing the proportion of U.S. securities. But this change in their portfolio distributions doesn't change the amount of net financial assets the trade surplus nations hold. In return for these net financial assets, the Americans buying goods and services from foreign exporters get real wealth, constituted by the goods and services purchased, shipped to the United States. On the surface, it seems to be an even trade, the goods and services for the dollars. Buffett's claim that such a trade deficit involves transferring our net worth to a foreign nation clearly only applies to net financial assets of the foreign sector and does not value the non-financial assets gained from trade or any further non-financial assets created using the initial non-financial assets resulting from the trade. In addition, it overlooks the government's capability to produce further net financial assets for the private sector after the trade occurs. Such creation of further net financial assets is quite routine in the United States as long as the United States runs a government budget deficit greater than the size of the trade deficit in a given time period. So Buffett's image is one of trade deficits draining irreplaceable net financial assets out of the private economy. But his image tacitly assumes the government will not be replacing those lost net financial assets with new ones created by budget deficits at least as large or even larger than the trade deficit. But it also should be obvious that as long as the government does that, then continuous trade deficits will be perfectly sustainable. In short, Buffett makes a critical initial error even before he goes into his economic fable about Squanderville and Thriftville. Now here's his narrative, which contains many more errors, myths, and unwarranted assumptions. Here's Buffett. Say there are two side-by-side islands of equal size, Squanderville and Thriftville, having only one kind of capital asset, land. The two communities are primitive, needing and producing only food, which people working 8 hours per day in both produce for subsistence, so each society is self-sufficient. But then things change. Thriftville citizens decide to save and invest and worked 16 hours a day to double their food output. They live off the food they produce in 8 hours of work and export an equal amount to their only trading partner, Squanderville. So I say, but why would the people of Thriftville do that? What does Squanderville have to trade that makes trading desirable for the citizens of Thriftville? And Buffett answers. He says, the citizens of Thriftville want bonds the government of Squanderville can issue costlessly, and they're willing to trade their surplus food for those bonds. Citizens of Squanderville want to avoid working and yet still get their food. So the trade is one of bonds, along with the interest on them paid in Squanderville reserves, which also can be issued by the Squanderville government for food. Getting the food in turn allows the squanders to be free from the need to grow food for as long as the people of both nations are willing to trade in this way. So I answer, the thrift want bonds and interests, which they get. The squanders want food, which they get. Both sides get what they want. So where's the problem here? Well, clearly, one problem with the fable is why would Thriftville want to trade with Squanderville for its reserves and or ultimately its bonds? After all Squanderville has is its ability to produce food and the labor it uses and the land and labor it uses to produce it. Under the assumed conditions, Squander will stop using its labor to produce food. So then all we'll have is the land they are not using. But why would Thriftville want this land since it can already grow twice as much as it needs on its own land? In short, there is no motivation for this fable, and surely Squanderville's situation bears no close resemblance to the United States, nor do its trading partners trade with the U.S. solely for the purpose of acquiring property of ours that they do not need, as apparently in Buffett's fable do the Thriftville traders. Also, second, there's a lurking sustainability problem for the squanders in this example of trade. The thrifts are free to end the trading of bonds for food at any moment and go back to working only 8 hours. But there will be a time lag between the reappearance of the squanders' need for food and their ability to supply enough of it from their efforts to sustain themselves. So because food is an essential product for which there is an immediate need, the squanders could not and would not enter into the kind of risky trading agreement envisioned here. So far, the assumption in the fable is that the squanders use their 8 hours per day freed up from food production to just loll on the beach. But what if they use their time to create other real capital assets that allow them to produce goods that the thrifts don't have and will want to trade for, provided that the productivity of the squanders is high enough to satisfy both their needs and the needs of Thriftville for the new products? Then, of course, the situation has changed. And even if the thrifts decide they want no more Squanderville bonds and convert all they hold into reserves, as long as the thrifts want the new Squanderville products, the squanders may be able to continue to get their food while the thrifts get what they want. Also, what happens if the squanders, in my scenario, can supply enough of its new products to satisfy the needs of both islands and do that in 6 rather than 8 hours per day? Then it still may be possible for the squanders to have at least part of their cake and eat it too, because depending on the strength of the demand and their own level of productivity, they may be able to have 2 hours of leisure per day, have 2 hours per day devoted to thinking up and developing the capacity to produce new products, and need only 4 hours per day to produce and sell enough of their new products that they can pay for their food imports from Thriftville too, using Thriftville reserves rather than squander reserves. In summary, one thing Buffett's fable hinges on for its supposed relevance to reality is its assumption that squanders will loll on the beach and not use their time to develop their own ability to produce goods they can sell. This is an unrealistic assumption, however, which real nations need not fulfill unless they, like the United States, continue to insist on keeping their workforces unemployed when jobs are lost due to imports. In addition, the fable's cogency also hinges on the assumptions that Thriftville would enter a trading arrangement, where there is little gain for them, rather than just continuing to work the 8 hours per day they had been working, and the complementary assumption that Squanderville would enter into a trading relation in which such a high risk to the survival of its citizens would exist. Both of these assumptions are unrealistic and do not correspond to the situations in which the United States and its trading partners find themselves. Buffett says, over time, Thriftville accumulates an enormous amount of Squanderville bonds, which represent claim checks on the future output of Squanderville. Pundits warn the squanders that to pay the debts, they will eventually have to work more than 8 hours. But the residents of Squanderville are unwilling to listen. And I answer that. It doesn't matter whether Thriftville accumulates bonds or reserves, since both are ultimately claim checks against present or future output of Squanderville, though reserves actually represent a more immediate claim on output than bonds, which ultimately have to be converted to reserves or currency before they are claim checks on output. But if the scenario I just outlined is closer to reality than Buffett's, then Squanderville would be able to repay its bonds and interest and satisfy the increased demand from added reserves in the market with their new products. Of course, this invalidation of the pundit warnings depends on how the squanders decide to use the free time they have acquired through their assumed trade deficit. But even if they do not use it to produce any output in the form of food or new products, Thriftville buyers would have claim checks on assets, on real assets. Buffett says, meanwhile, the citizens of Thriftville begin to get nervous about the IOUs of a shiftless island. So the thrifts change by continuing to hold some bonds, but selling most to Squanderville residents, and use the Squanderville bucks to buy Squanderville land and acquire all of Squanderville. Oh, that's the horrific result of all this, that the Chinese will own everything in the United States, right? I answered that. They would be unlikely to sell many of their bonds to Squanderville residents because an attempt to do that over a short time would drive down the value of their bonds. So thrifters would probably have to wait until the bonds mature to get reserves, or alternatively, they would have to get the reserves by using the bonds as security for loans from banks that would apply squander buck reserves, the needed claim checks to buy goods, services, and assets of Squanderville. Once they had those, they could buy real Squanderville property. But by then, assuming my revised scenario of newly created products, they would be a lot more likely to buy. They would be a lot more to buy other than land. So whether or not they would own all of Squanderville would depend on just how much another real property was available other than farmland, which would no longer be the only productive asset in Squanderville in my revised scenario. But even assuming no change in Buffett's scenario, but Thriftville may not be able to own all of Squanderville because, one, as thrifters buy farmland, they would be transferring net financial assets to squanders, providing them with the means to compete for available farmland with the thrifters. And two, the squander banks and the squander government could, through reserve creation, easily supply squander residents with the reserve/currency needed to compete for the available farmland. This expansion of money, fueled by the thrifters' own willingness to acquire squander property, would create an asset bubble in Squanderville, preventing the thrifters from owning all of Squanderville, even in Buffett's unmodified and unrealistic scenario. Going back to Buffett, the squanders would now return to working 8 hours a day and, quote, must also work additional hours to service their debt and pay Thriftville rent on the land so imprudently sold, unquote. In effect, Squanderville has been colonized by purchase rather than conquest. And I reply, again, whether this would happen or not depends on how Squanderville uses the real resources they have acquired through running their trade deficit, and it also depends on the specifics of attempts to acquire that farmland. If their own economic policy uses the resources gained in return for their IOUs wisely, Squanderville can't be colonized by purchase because it will have much more than farmland available for sale. In addition, if the Thriftville buyers flood Squanderville with squander bucks in order to buy farmland, and they will find themselves competing against both Thriftville buyers and squanders who have just acquired bucks in return for land. So if the market is too active, then again, asset inflation will occur, and the Thriftville buyers will be spending a lot of their Squanderville IOUs very fast while decreasing their bang for each squander buck. Again, reducing the likelihood they will dominate ownership in Squanderville. So Buffett says, it can be argued that the present value of the future production that Squanderville must forever shift to Thriftville only equates to the production Thriftville initially gave up, and that therefore both have received a fair deal. But Since one generation of squanders gets the free ride and future generations pay in perpetuity for it, there are, in economist talk, some pretty dramatic, quote, intergenerational inequities, unquote. And I say in return, this assumes many things not in the original specification of the fable. The Squanderville bonds purchased by Thriftville can be paid off when they fall due, since Squanderville can issue reserves and new bonds costlessly. In addition, no assumption was specified that Squanderville's trade deficits would last for generations unless squanders repaid them by working extra hours. The only initial assumption was that squanders would get their food and gain free time for an indefinite period. That could be short or long, but presumably there would be time enough for Squanderville to use its free time constructively so it could avoid the extra hours fate that Buffett assumes. And here's Buffett with the fallacy. Think of it in terms of a family, a household, the household analogy. What if I can get suppliers of all that I consume in my lifetime to take Buffett family IOUs payable in goods and services and with interest added by my descendants? This may seem an even trade between the Buffalo family and its creditors, but future generations of Buffetts won't applaud the deal, and heaven forbid may even attempt to welsh on it. And I say in reply, don't think of it like a family, unless the Buffett family IOUs are like government IOUs. Squanderville and U.S. IOUs are government IOUs. They are payable in reserves, not goods and services. Also, the IOUs are interest-bearing debt instruments, and the Buffett family's promise is to pay them back in non-interest-bearing debt instruments, namely Buffett bucks, which can be produced costlessly and which the creditors must take, provided we assume the Buffett family is like the Squanderville or U.S. governments. So why would Buffett's descendants or future squanders or future generations of Americans welsh on such debts as long as they can just issue fiat money to pay them back when due? Back to Buffett. Sooner or later, Squanderville, facing increasing payments to service debt, would decide to embrace highly inflationary policies, that is, issue more squander bucks to dilute the value of each. This conclusion, including highly inflationary, I say in response, is vague and ambiguous, and depending on the interpretation of that key phrase, is not supported by Buffett's initial assumptions. For example, if we say that highly inflationary means something like the experience of Weimar or Zimbabwe, and there's nothing in Buffett's assumptions that supports such a conclusion. For the sake of argument, let's say the term means at least a 10% constant rise in prices, and that conclusion still doesn't follow from his assumptions. How about 5% per year constant rise in prices? That still doesn't follow from his assumptions. So what does Buffett mean here exactly? This is not to say, of course, that Squanderville might not adopt policies designed to dilute the value of the dollar, but if Squanderville follows normal growth policies, then the value of its currency will depreciate over time anyway in what is a normal process for a growing economy that needs continuous issuing of money. So the value of any real wealth owned by investors in Squanderville will also depreciate, even assuming normal rates of growth of the supply of net financial assets. Hence, squander bucks may or may not lose value faster than other investments such as land, the value of which may crash if there is a bubble in real estate values, fueled by everyone following Buffett-style advice, followed quickly by an expected crash of real estate values. Also, why does Buffett infer that increasing payments to service debt will ensue for the Squanderville government? What happens if Squanderville's treasury decides to stop selling debt instruments to its creditors, but just issues currency or reserves to pay back debts as they fall due? Then if Thriftville wants to sell its food, it will have to accept reserves in return, with no option to use the reserves to buy interest-bearing debt. And if it is willing to do that, then interest payments will no longer increase because the total face value of all debt-bearing instruments will be declining over time, even with continued deficit spending by the government to get squander bucks into the hands of citizens so they can continue to import Thriftville food. And if Squanderville doesn't want to go that far, it could also issue new short-term debt instruments with interest rates close to zero and continuously roll those over. If that happened, would Thriftville refuse to sell its food for reserves? Would it let that food spoil? Would it refuse to buy any more Squanderville bonds with reserves it had so that it could earn interest in the future? And if it did, would that stop Squanderville central banks from issuing reserves to buy bonds from bond dealers as they fell due and to fund Squanderville Treasury spending as well? Also, this discussion highlights a salient feature of Buffett's example. He assumes not only one kind of product per island, but also a kind of product that is essential for people and one that requires some significant lead time to produce, so that the nation that decides to discontinue its own production of that kind of good is then at the mercy of its trading partner. Is that an example with relevance for the United States? I doubt it. Going back to Buffett, the prospect of devaluation or default is why I would opt for direct ownership of Squanderville land rather than bonds of the island's government. Most governments find it much harder morally to seize foreign-owned property than they do to dilute the purchasing power of claim checks the foreigners hold. Theft by stealth is preferred to theft by force. That's a good point. But I say in response, but if Buffett would buy land rather than bonds, then what would the squanders who profit from investors like him buying land do? They would also buy land because its value would be going up. And because in this one category of product world, once the need for food is fulfilled, there's nothing else to spend on in his scenario except land and bonds. And land would be plentiful while bonds would be plentiful while land would be scarce. As its value rose, the available squander bucks held by thrifts would buy less land than at the beginning of the boom in land speculation. Okay, and Buffett says, what does all this have to do with the United States? Well, the U.S. was operating like Thriftville from the end of World War II to the early 70s. The 70s were a time of transition. But in the late 1970s, things reversed and we began to run trade deficits and transfer our wealth to other nations. After 1980, we acted like Squanderville, and the annual trade deficit as of 2003 exceeded 4% of GDP, and the rest of the world owns a staggering $2.5 trillion more of the U.S. than we own of other countries. Some of this $2.5 trillion is invested in claim checks, U.S. bonds, both governmental and private, and some in such assets as property and equity securities. In effect, our country has been behaving like an extraordinarily rich family that possesses an immense farm in order to consume 4% more than we produce. That's the trade deficit. We have day by day been both selling pieces of the farm and increasing the mortgage on what we still own. And I say in response, actually, we've never acted much like either Squanderville or Thriftville, in the sense we've been a nation that produces only agricultural products and trades with only one other nation that has no other products or services to exchange with us. We've also had other kinds of capital assets apart from land. In addition, even though we've acquired more products and trade than we've produced for some time now, what we've paid for these products has been net financial assets, which we can easily replace whenever we please by using our currency issuing authority. What we've lost that is not quickly or easily replaceable is part of our industrial base that arguably we may need to some degree in the future. And we've also lost positions that employed millions of people at relatively high wages. But the resulting unemployment and greater level of inequality hasn't been due to trade alone, but rather to the things we have not done to compensate for trade impacts by creating other high-wage jobs using the capability of our government to directly create jobs at a living wage. Buffett goes further. More important, however, is that foreign ownership of our assets will grow at about 500 billion per year at the present the trade deficit level, which means that the deficit will be adding about 1 percentage point annually to foreigners' net ownership of our national assets. As that ownership grows, so will the annual net investment income flowing out of this country. That will leave us paying ever increasing dividends and interest to the world rather than being a net receiver of them as in the past. We have entered the world of negative compounding. Goodbye, pleasure. Hello, pain. And I say in response, there are a number of problems here. One is a problem of detail. The increase in foreign ownership of U.S. assets has grown by about 450 B per year since 2003, not by 500 billion, with variations between 326 billion and 526 billion. In 2014, it was 524 billion and has been on an upward trend with variations since the low point in 2009, just after the great financial crash. The second problem, however, is that the proportion of net wealth owned by foreigners has not increased by anywhere near 1 percentage point each year since 2003, but by an average of about 0.7% per year, and has been going down since 2009 as the rate of increase in national wealth has been increasing relative to the rate of growth of foreign ownership of U.S. reserves / currency or debt instruments. Third, if the U.S. government wanted to increase net financial assets owned by American entities in the private sector as a percentage of total wealth, then all it has to do is to increase deficit spending as a percentage of total wealth faster than the rate of increase of the trade deficit as a percentage of total wealth. It can do that easily enough if it wishes to do so, and if it does that, then gradually, over a period of years, the percentage of national wealth owned by foreigners will decline. And then Buffett's worry about paying too much in profits to the rest of the world and being owned disproportionately by foreigners will go away. But fourth, and most importantly, why is it significant that there has been a small rate of growth in percent of foreign ownership of dollar-denominated assets since 2003? Why should we care? The owners of our bonds cannot dump them into markets without themselves losing a great deal of money. The holders of reserves don't want to spend them on our exports because they want to run trade surpluses and accumulate dollar assets. These holders of our reserves may want to buy U.S. assets, but as long as they engage in normal market operations, that doesn't do any harm. Then why is that a problem for us? And if they are behaving in ways that we believe are somehow harmful to the United States, then we can regulate these harmful activities and prevent them from damaging our economy, our society. The basic point, which was made, by Randy Wray in 2012 on page 131, of his book, is that if foreign owners of dollar assets are operating in America, they are subject to our rules, our house, our rules. But it may be relevant to mention at this point that the pending trade agreements, quote unquote, to be discussed later, would involve the kinds of restrictions on our sovereignty that would make us constrain our house, our rules, making the U.S. more vulnerable to the manipulations of foreign interests that hold large amounts in U.S. financial assets. So this, in other words, is really an argument against the free trade treaties that Buffett was supporting. So Buffett then says, we were taught in Economics 101, that's the trouble, we believe what we're taught in Economics 101, that countries could not for long sustain large, ever-growing trade deficits. At a point, so it was claimed, the spree of the consumption-happy nation would be braked by currency rate adjustments and by the unwillingness of creditor countries to accept an endless flow of IOUs from the big spenders. And that's the way it has indeed worked for the rest of the world, as we can see by the abrupt shutoffs of credits that many profligate nations have suffered in recent decades. The U.S., however, enjoys special status. In effect, we can behave today as we wish because our past financial behavior was so exemplary. And because we are so rich, neither our capacity nor our intention to pay is questioned, and we continue to have a mountain of desirable assets to trade for consumables. In other words, our national credit card allows us to charge truly breathtaking amounts, but that card's credit line is not limitless. And I say, I don't know who we is. Most Americans can't behave as they wish. And we don't have a national credit card as much as we have foreign traders who are willing to sell their exports to U.S. importers in return for our reserves. They push imported goods at American customers who pay for them with money they already possess or can get through the willingness of U.S. banks to lend them the money they use. It is the U.S. banks or the U.S. government which creates the money we use in importing goods. There is no foreign money or foreign credit involved. The role of our debt instruments in trade is this. Once foreign nations have sent their goods to importers and gotten paid using dollars, they exchange those dollars for local currency so that the dollars paid for the goods ends up being owned by the central bank of the exporting nation. That central bank deposits the dollars in their reserve account at one of the Federal Reserve banks. There the dollars remained until the foreign central bank decides to either convert them to debt instruments or to facilitate the purchase of goods, services, or assets by foreign purchasers. Often the choice is made to convert the dollars to dollar-denominated debt instruments in order to earn a higher rate of interest than is available from the interest on reserves that is paid by the Federal Reserve Bank. This has been a lengthy analysis of Buffett's argument that running continuous trade deficits is a problem. The analysis is important because the proponents of balanced trade policy haven't questioned his analysis and seem to uncritically accept the proposition that there is a serious problem with continuous trade deficits because they are supposedly unsustainable for the United States. The whole edifice of balanced trade policy and its desirability or necessity hinges on this idea. For if it is false, then balanced trade policy and their specific proposals are all unnecessary. We can summarize the problems with Buffett's analysis fairly briefly. First, the analogy to the United States expressed in his fable is invalid because it is so unrealistic that it bears little resemblance to our current situation. Second, he seems to assume that the stock of financial assets is more fixed than it actually is, so that an absolute increase in net financial assets held by foreigners means that they're gaining a disproportionate capability to dominate purchases of real American assets over time, as well as a disproportionate share of net financial assets. I've argued that the government of the United States, due to its power to issue currency and reserves, can always remedy a situation where foreigners own too great a proportion of our assets, if that is viewed as a problem, simply by ceasing to issue debt and by creating more net financial assets in the hands of Americans. I've also argued that since Buffett's analysis, and particularly since the Great Crash, the share of national wealth owned by foreigners has been declining anyway. And finally, I pointed out that it is highly doubtful that the growth in the rate of the proportion of wealth owned by foreigners is a problem of unsustainability for the United States anyway. Third, Buffett's use of the government is like a household analogy. To try to contend that continuous deficits are a problem doesn't work because the government isn't like the Buffett or any other household, since no household can issue currency and get the population to accept it as a legal means of payment. Fourth, Buffett's argument relies on the fallacy that government debts incurred by this generation will be a heavy burden on future generations because our children and grandchildren will eventually have to pay back such debts with their tax money earned by working harder. The fallacy in that, however, is that our children, as long as they retain a monetarily sovereign fiat currency, will be able to repay all government debts as they fall due while working no longer or harder than they would have had to work if all government debts had been paid off. This conclusion follows from the idea that the debts involved are the debts of the government, that the government always has the means to create the reserves necessary to meet all debt repayments. And fifth, Buffett's contrived example of two nations making the same kind of product, and only that kind of product where both parties' workforces work 8 hours per day to begin with, and then one of these nations doubles the amount of work it undertakes, doesn't apply to the United States because the United States has many products and many trading partners, as well as a hardworking population willing to work longer hours than the people of most of the modern nations. The trade deficit of the United States hasn't been produced by a lazy workforce that wants to loll on the beach, as the squanders in his example do, and also want to be able to import the food they need to do that. The reason for its deficit is that other nations want to export to the United States because they want to acquire a surplus of US dollars to trade with, and they want to create jobs for their workforce by employing it to produce goods for export. They view exporting and running a trade surplus as their way of getting to prosperity, and they send us real wealth in return for the USD reserves that our government issues and our citizens and corporations hold. As long as they continue to believe that, then our running continuous trade deficits will continue to be sustainable, provided we can adapt to the domestic impact of these deficits in areas other than trade. And if they stop wanting that, then they will scale down their exports to us gradually, and our trade deficit will decline accordingly. Again, so what? Don't we want them to reduce their trade surplus with us? Next is the concluding section. There is no fiscal sustainability problem inherent in running continuous trade deficits. There is also no political sustainability problem, as long as the government is willing to enact the necessary policies to allow the domestic economic system to compensate for the continuous trade deficits on employment. In the introduction, I pointed out that, quote, exports are real costs and imports are real benefits. I also argued that, other things being equal, we would prefer to have the real benefits of trade deficits rather than the real costs of trade surpluses, but that other things are not equal. If government does nothing to compensate for the shorter and longer term effects on the domestic economy in the areas of high unemployment, depressed wages, shrinking of the middle class, and growing economic inequality, then these problems will create a political reaction, destabilizing any trade policy resulting in continuous trade deficits. On the other hand, these effects of trade deficits can be avoided without implementing balanced trade as a continuous policy. How? I'll answer that question in the concluding chapter of the book. For now, I'll note that all the problems just highlighted can be handled so that we can have politically sustainable trade deficits, allowing us to accumulate real wealth if our trade partners want to keep sending it to us. However, these problems can't be handled by trade itself. So to enjoy the benefits of trade deficits, one needs to move out of the policy silo of trade and into the area of budgetary and fiscal policy, which we will do presently after we go over fair trade policy and trade policy for the public purpose. So this is a good stopping place for tonight. We'll go into the next chapter next time. That is on fair trade policy, which currently is the sexy form of trade policy for progressives. Okay, so we'll be analyzing that, and we will see that it's really not one policy, but there are a few approaches involved in fair trade policy. So I will now entertain your questions and ideas. I'll stop sharing. And now consider your comments. Okay. So I see more of you stuck with me tonight than last night. That's good. Very good. I'm happy to do that. I was very happy to do this chapter, partly because I'm very proud of this chapter. I think that this chapter is kind of a tour de force. I'd be happy to have your comments on it, but I don't think there are many people in this world who have read it. And I think it really dismisses the idea, okay, of balanced trade. Jesse Donnelly says, hi, Jesse Donnelly. Hi, Deborah Wilson. Balancing the budget is a joke. If Buffett says he's for it, it's got to be wrong. He doesn't say he's for balancing the budget. He allows for deficits, but he doesn't think we should go beyond 3%. What he's for is balancing trade. It's the policy of trade balance that he's for. He is one of the major problems in our country. He's an evil old billionaire bastard. Sandy says, better late than never. Lana says, we might have to start charging you a late fee, Deborah. Kay says, in my experience, the richer most people are, the lesser you can trust them. Kay says, we need to elect a progressive government that can be trusted, at least to a point. Evelina says, so was Buffett making honest mistakes, or was he a posturing villain all along? I'm sure I don't know, but I think he went to the trouble of developing some examples and trying to reason his way through this. You know, the Thriftville and the Squanderville analogy, and it was really nicely constructed. He just didn't pursue the analogy far enough. I don't know whether he was a villain all along. I know that he's been profiting very greatly from the present system. And therefore, the way he wants to modify the present system is certainly okay in marginal ways. But he was the one who pointed out that he's being taxed far too little, and that he doesn't pay any more in taxes as a percentage of his income each year than his secretary does. Kay says, villain is my guess, Evelina. And Lana says, hi, Rob. Evelina says, oh, no, not the household analogy. What a turd. And Lana says, people think Buffett is a nice guy. I no longer feel that way. He is very neoliberal. He is very neoliberal. He is very neoliberal. Evelina says, a little turd at any rate. But Buffett is a midget. A mean one, laugh out loud. Joe knows of a very demanding chatterbox TV watching mom for a house guest, making my involvement difficult. Deborah, I didn't know it was your mom, but it's all right. It's not a problem. Don't worry about it. Evelina says, mean used to mean stingy. He's that too. Well, he's always been very economical, let's put it this way, with his money. He values monetary value. He values hanging on to the dollar. Evelina says, I sympathize, laugh out loud. Kay says, put an extra beer in the fridge, as I know it will be too hot to sleep anytime soon. SMH, I hate this heat. Evelina says, I sympathize, Deborah, laugh out loud. Deborah says, Evelina, Pont. Evelina smiles. Evelina says, where are the boys? Only ladies today, laugh out loud. Sandy says, we had a couple. Did they all leave? I guess the boys don't want to learn economics. Only the ladies want to learn economics. Deborah says, I'm in. Evelina says, a progressive trade policy will be interesting for sure. I'm looking forward to it. There are two versions of trade policy that might be called progressive. One I'll cover next time with fair trade policy. And you'll remember, Bernie talks a lot about fair trade policy. Okay. So that's what he's for. That's what he understands. The kind of trade policy that I put forward, I think is progressive trade policy in the real sense, because it's concerned with public purpose in the various nations that are trading. It's trade policy for public purpose, and we will get to that. Catherine Tokarska says, ladies rock. I'm personally of that opinion myself. I'm happy to have only ladies here. That's just fine. But I don't know what happened to my gentlemen at all. I don't see any gentlemen who are applying. I don't think Jesse Donnelly is a gentleman because I seem to see ladies on her icon. Okay, I did invite a bunch of guys, including Russell. I would have thought that at least the Russell will be here. Steve Gonzo was here at the start anyway. I assume Steve Gonzo is a gentleman. Anyway, Kay says women have been shortchanged forever. Yes, I've noticed that. And I am not happy about it since I have a wife and I have a daughter. And Joanne says, oh, Russell was here earlier. I guess I just didn't see him comment. He usually comments. Sandy says, so is Rob. You mean but that Rob Rivera was here? Or Rob Ravaroo, as he calls himself these days? When he comes, he usually says, hey, Yoda, what's going on? Oh, there's Rob. Hey, Yoda. Thank you, Rob. I was missing that. Yes, him. How you doing? I'm doing fine. I'm doing fine. I got a chance to expound on my critique of free trade and my critique, okay, of balanced trade. And I am really happy with those. I'm really happy with those. And I want other people to know about them. So I'm really glad you're here. I don't know if you've been here for that long, but wait until you get a load of the fair trade critique. And then the trade for public purpose ideas. I have to say, I think the framework of this book is pretty original. And I haven't seen it in other MMT things. Rob says, I can till you cover fair trade. I never had a chance to understand the left position on trade, but I want a real understanding from an MMT perspective. Now, I'll try to provide a real understanding from an MMT perspective, assuming that my perspective is an MMT perspective. I don't know whether the MMT fathers would agree. I think they might agree so far in terms of the way I handled free trade and the way I handled the balanced trade perspective. I certainly very much emphasize the idea that exports are real costs and imports are real benefits. I certainly reflect that. Evelina says, a nice rooster. Ha ha ha. Yeah, Rob's pretty cool. Any other comments or questions? Next time we get to fair trade. I hope there'll be enough time to finish it. I think there will be. I don't think I'll try to do more than fair trade for the time being. And Rob said, what book is it? Yes, I much prefer a trade deficit instead of the surplus. Okay, this book is entitled, let me share the screen once again and remind everybody about this book. And let me go back to where's my, there we go. The title of this book is Who Needs Balanced Trade? Who Needs Balanced Budgets? It's a Kindle ebook. It goes for $9.99, okay, at Amazon. And it is my attempt to outline an MMT-based trade policy. So if that's what you're interested in, then this is the book for you. Also, don't forget my Patreon account, which is at patreon.com /Joe_Firestone. I haven't said much about that in recent days. Okay, I don't know why. Evelina says, finally, and Rob says, the trade deficit is a major benefit for us because we can start working on the social value sector. And we can start working on the Green New Deal, which of course includes work on the social value sector, but it also involves real work on survival, the most valuable thing. We can start working on survival. And if we work on survival and enhance survival, the value of our real assets is going to go shooting up. Kay says, thank you, Joe and all, for another great discussion. And Rob says, wow, this is your book. Is it available in the Apple Store? No, it's available as a Kindle book, okay, on Amazon. It was run in 2015. I have 6 MMT books, Rob. 6 Kindle books. So Rob may need a reminder about those books. Let me see. Maybe it's quicker just to do it this way. Right, it was quicker. There it comes. Okay. So, here are my 6 books. Let me share that with you. It's the easiest way to do it. Share screen. The Opera tab. What am I doing? I'm doing this the wrong way, but that's all right. It'll work. Here are my 6 books. Fiscal Myths of the 2010 Campaign. The Declarations of Dependence, Trade Tyranny, Sovereignty, and Democracy. Those 2 are MMT books. This one, Declarations of Dependence, Trade Tyranny, Sovereignty, and Democracy, is about the fight over the trade agreements a few years back in 2015. It's about the impact of the pending trade agreements at that time on our monetary sovereignty and other things that we hold dear. There's the third book on the overall MMT trade perspective. Here's my book on the platinum coin, still the only book on the platinum coin, Fixing the Debt Without Breaking America, Austerity, the $1 trillion coin, and Ending Debt Ceiling, Sequester, and Budgetary Crises. And then two more books, also MMT books, Real Fiscal Responsibility, Volume 1, The Progressive Give Up Formula, and then Real Fiscal Responsibility, Volume 2, The Peterson Network, Inequality and the Failure of Neoliberalism. And then one more MMT book, a seventh MMT book. This book is called Austerity, Greece's Debt Crisis, and the Theft of Democracy. It was written in 2015 from the perspective of 2015 and was based on a workshop sponsored by Bernie Sanders. Okay, it was moderated by Stephanie Kelton, and the panelists were Jamie Galbraith, Joe Stiglitz, and Jacob Kierkegaard, and it was held at the Senate. And what I do is it's a write-up of what was said at that particular conference and my commentary on it. It's about the fix that Greece found itself in, and had also some original chapters as about how it could get out of that fix. And there's an eighth book here, and the eighth book does not have to do with MMT. It's basically a knowledge management book, and the name of it, is Riskonomics, Reducing Risk by Killing Your Worst Ideas. All of these books are Kindle books. They all sell for $9.99. I price them all the same way. So, yes, I was reading from one of my books, Rob. Evelina says, MMT-based fair trade policy, not MMT-based fair trade policy, but MMT-based policy based on nations concluding trade policy for public purpose. Insofar as the U.S., the public purpose involves fair trade policy, then yes, we would be pursuing fair trade policy. Stephanie, in her book, talked about a trade policy involving collaboration with others, a trade policy based on good deals for them and good deals for us. That is the kind of trade policy that would be consistent with trade policy for the public purpose. Evelina says, the Green New Deal, the way to go. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Rob says, sometimes I question if there is a public policy that I can prefer over others. And for me, I prefer the job guarantee. I love the job guarantee as well, Rob. Joanne says both the Green New Deal and the federal job guarantee. Lena says the JG is under Bernie's Green New Deal. It's a big part of it. Yes, it is. That is right, Evelina. Evelina says, do you need capacitation? It's part of the job guarantee and it would be free. Evelina says, they go together, Joanne. Sandy says, hello, Bonnie. Hey, Bonnie, Sandy noticed you're here. Yeah, Bonnie's here, Sandy. Thank you for asking. Okay, I guess I'm done for tonight. I'm going to come back tomorrow night with fair trade policy. Okay, I now like the way this is going. Okay, I wish we had a few more people, but we are missing some important people tonight, I suppose, because there are many other things that are going on. And so that's just the way it is. It's just the way it is. So thank you all for helping. Thank you all for being here. And I'll hope to see you tomorrow at 9 p.m. Thursday night at 9 p.m. for the Fair Trade chapter. See you then. Thank you and good night all.